Okay, so Captain Marvel has now come out, and it's made a lot of money, and a lot of people have seen it, and a lot of people are saying it's so-so. It's definitely so-so, and I think that's being reflected in certain areas of the internet, specifically Rotten Tomatoes, which is definitely a metric that you should never fully trust in its entirety. But someone over on the Marvel subreddit decided to put together the tomato meter and the audience score for all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies to give us an idea at the discrepancy between the critical review and the audience review over the span of the last 11 years. And it's interesting. So take a look here at Iron Man. Right, came out May 2008 with a 93% certified fresh and a 91% audience score, followed immediately a month, some odd change later, by The Incredible Hulk, which garnered 67%, but a 70% audience score. Now, I still think that The Hulk was definitely a lot better movie than people give it credit for, but I can see why ultimately it ended up getting the score that it did. But again, the audience seemed to like it a little bit more than the critics, and the same thing, kind of went the opposite for Iron Man. Now, looking at Iron Man 2 here, which is obviously one of the more hotly contested films in the MCU, we see it has a 73% and a 71% audience score, giving it a negative 2% discrepancy, but still relatively on point. And looking here at Thor, which came out a little over a year later, this got a 77% tomato meter and a 76% audience score. Again, these are pretty much rolling in line with one another. We can start to see that the fans are liking the movie about as much as the critics. Everything's kind of on point. Even coming over here to Captain America: The First Avenger, where there was a greater critical score for it rather than the 74% audience score. I'm not entirely too sure why that is. I thought Captain America: The First Avenger was a really solid entry into the MCU, albeit it was it was better than it got better than Thor, correct? Yeah, it did do better than Thor on the critical side, but definitely not the audience side. And looking here at the Avengers, which came out a year later, we can see that it actually had a 92% critical score and a 91% audience score, with over 1 million people having rated it on there. So clearly everyone really loved the Avengers, right? But that was phase one. That was phase one. Once we got into phase two, things got a little bit crazier because Marvel was kind of entering into sequel territory, and at least more sequels. So let's take a look here. Iron Man 3's critical consensus was 80% certified fresh with a 78% audience score. And I think this is probably more accurate than not. A lot of people out there always tell me Iron Man 3 is the worst Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. But if you look here at Thor: The Dark World, we can see that it's got 66% not certified fresh, same like The Incredible Hulk, and an audience score of 76%. So I think more people enjoyed Thor: The Dark World than the critics did. If you want my honest opinion, Thor: The Dark World is still pretty rewatchable in many ways because of the chemistry between Loki and Thor, as well as the fact that it is a very beautiful movie. It was the first movie really produced that came out after Disney acquired. Iron Man 3 and Thor were both 2013. So those were the first movies that came out after Disney picked up picked up Marvel. And we're making the next films after the acquisition in 2010. Then we can see here Captain America: Winter Soldier. This one, again, audiences and critics were very much on point here. 90% certified fresh, 92% audience score. And Guardians of the Galaxy, very similar, 91% tomato meter, 92% audience score. And I find it interesting to look at the reviews counted on this one, because reviews counted are 286 for Captain America, but it's 310 for Guardians of the Galaxy. So there was 24 more reviews for Guardians than for Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which came out a few months prior. Maybe they opened up their whole thing there. Who knows? But then 2015 brought us Avengers: Age of Ultron, which was a 75% tomato meter, but the audiences really liked it. This is, again, kind of showing us that there's been a discrepancy building between the critics and the fans on more or less the sequels versus more of a new film, especially because looking here with an origin story of Ant-Man coming in at 82% critical rating and an 86% for the origin story. And again, the origin story seemed to do better than the sequels do. Right. Well, with the exception of this one here, Captain America: Civil War from 2016. I mean, at this point, we're already 4 years into the MCU. And that one, 91% tomato meter with an 89% audience score. I don't know where that 89% came from. I mean, everyone I talk to about Civil War, it oftentimes is like their favorite movie. But then Doctor Strange, again, 89% to 86%, about in that same range, but also an origin story. So it kind of feels like it's, you know, it's right on par with everything else. Coming down here, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 and Spider-Man Homecoming. People seem to really like it, 84% to 87%. And then with Spider-Man, it's 92% to 88%. And the critics did seem to appreciate Spider-Man Homecoming a bit more than the audience did, and that was also because it does feel like Spider-Man Homecoming played it a little bit too safe in some avenues. But still, we can see that 2017 outings for these movies are still very much in line with everything. Now, the one I was most concerned about was going to be Thor Ragnarok, because my initial reaction to Thor Ragnarok was not very good. I walked out of the theater going, I don't know. It felt like it tried too hard. But since then, I've seen Thor Ragnarok a number of times, and we can see here that so did the audience. The discrepancy was only 5%, with a 92% critical rating and an 87% audience score. But here we get into the interesting bits when we start looking at Black Panther. 97% critical rating on 457 reviews. 79% of the audience liked it. Now, a lot of times with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, upon years passing from the films coming out and that initial fanfare kind of wearing off, people start to see the cracks of the movies. We can go back even now and look at the previous movies and go, yeah, there's definitely a fair amount of problems that have arisen in regards to these movies, right? You know, you can go back and go Thor: The Dark World, maybe not as good points, but it was kind of middling in its take. The Incredible Hulk, I feel, got better over time. Iron Man 3 was always good in my opinion, and Iron Man 2 is the weakest of the trilogy, but still not a bad movie. But then looking at Black Panther kind of, I think, out of most of the movies, because originally I didn't even care much for Doctor Strange going into it, ended up really loving it. Black Panther looked really good, and I feel it was a good movie, but at the same time, it felt also like a lot like Lion King, and the story did feel a little bit derivative, but audiences still very much responded. However, one must ask the question in regards to certain films. Are these, this 97% that it has here from the tomato meter, how many of those 457 reviewers, which is far above like almost all the other ones, or the average before, if you look at the numbers, you're seeing around 280 or so is kind of around an average, but this one is in the 450s. How many of those people played ball with Black Panther in order to maintain their access? Now, look, I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but after that Sci-Fi Wire podcast talking about that situation, I very much question a lot of people's motivations and everything else going into it. Now, let's take a look here at Avengers Infinity War with an 85% critical rating with 419 reviews. Again, I don't know how Black Panther got better reviews than Endgame. I'm sorry, I don't get it. I think Endgame fired on all cylinders basically the entire time. It handled how many people did it have in there? It had dozens of people that it worked on, or well over a dozen of heroes that it worked with, and it gave them all appropriate screen time while crafting a very, very compelling story centered around a very charismatic and very well-regarded villain, something that the Marvel Cinematic Universe hasn't had much of until Thanos. Let's be fair, Thanos is definitely the best villain thus far. Just wait until Galactus shows up. All I'm saying on that front. But the audience score was 91%. But that's kind of weird too, that the audience score was 91% with 52,000. 52,000, but come up here, look at the audience score for this one. 86,000 people voted for Black Panther, but only 52,000 voted for Infinity War. That to me, again, seems really weird. And it's another thing that brings up the discrepancy involving Rotten Tomatoes and how it's handled. The way that the audience score was first being hit was actually at the end of 2017 in regards to The Last Jedi. There was a lot of talk about that alt-right group that was coming in to bombard the audience scores, and it wasn't until just recently that that Rotten Tomatoes decided to really kind of tweak the system. So one must ask themselves, are all of these numbers to be believed one way or another? But even coming down here, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp with 88% and a 77% audience score, which does feel more accurate to me. I think the critics gave it a lot more love. I don't know if that's because of the woke factor involved by having the Wasp in the title. I felt that the movie was ultimately pointless in regards to where it stands in the MCU, but I do love me some Paul Rudd, and I'll take Ant-Man any day of the week. On the audience score, but only 21,000 people voted, giving it a 77%. And then coming down here, looking at Captain Marvel, with what just obviously came out, with an 81% tomato meter and a 37% audience score. Now, this is where there's you look at Black Panther and you look at Captain Marvel, and the audience score and the critical score are way, way, way different. Like they're way, way, way different. And there's a reason for that too, is there's been a lot of people that have been vocalizing their unhappiness with certain elements of Captain Marvel leading into the film, but we also don't know how many of those 58,000 people, and that was, by the way, I should point out, by the way, that this audience score was from 2 days ago, is when this post was taken, and so I don't quite know if that is the current setting or not. In fact, coming over here to Captain Marvel's current score, this is taken at 3:38 p.m. on March 10th, we can see that the tomato meter is down and that they have definitely manipulated the audience score, removing 57,000 or 51,000 of those previous scores to drop it to kind of reset it, and now it's at a 53%. So we can see that there's clearly a discrepancy here, and Rotten Tomatoes has covered its tracks by removing a lot of those negative reviews for Captain Marvel. We know that they were going to be hitting Last Jedi and hitting Solo and even hitting Infinity War in some cases. So it's really interesting to see those numbers kind of juxtaposed against one another, knowing that Rotten Tomatoes is not against eliminating bad actors, if you will, but we don't know their internal data. We don't know the internal elements of it. So we don't know how many of those bad actors are legitimate and how many are actually just bot accounts. So it's, or I should say legitimately bad actors or people that are just voicing their negative opinion of the film. And the two are very different. But it's interesting, again, to look at how over the span of 11 years, the critical consensus and the audience score were very much close together for like almost the entire time. So what's happened in recent years? What's caused that recent problem? Well, my opinion ultimately does boil down to the culture war, but the culture war is not necessarily with the films themselves or the filmmakers. Not everything that gets blown up is a Ghostbusters 2016 scenario. What we have here is a media that runs to protect these films from any kind of critics. They did it with The Last Jedi, they did it with Black Panther, they did it with Captain Marvel, and they're going to continue doing it. So one of the reasons why, when I put out that video yesterday that says that Captain Marvel effectively helped to destroy Rotten Tomatoes' credibility, this also gives you an idea of where it was working as intended, for the most part, just letting it kind of naturally flow, but then it became a weapon. And when Rotten Tomatoes becomes weaponized is part of the problem with trusting it completely at all. So I do leave it to you. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think that we're going to start seeing more discrepancies like this as things go on? And what is your prediction for Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home as they finish coming out later on this year?